On the morning of November 12th, 1858, a clerk named Theodore Boudreau sat at a small table in the courtyard of the St. Martinville Mercantile Warehouse and recorded in his usual compact script the sale of 14 enslaved individuals. The auction had begun at 9 o'clock under a sky that threatened rain but never delivered it. By 11:30, 11 people had been sold to planters from Lafayette, Breaux Bridge, and New Iberia. The 12th lot, a field hand from a bankrupt sugar plantation, went to a bidder from Baton Rouge for $412. The 13th, a carpenter's apprentice of 19 years, was purchased by a local builder. Then came the 14th lot, and that was when Theodore Boudreau's pen stopped. The entry for Lot 14 occupies 3 lines in the parish ledger, but between the second and third lines there is a space that corresponds, according to Theodore's later recollection, to approximately 7 minutes. He never explained the gap in writing. He simply recorded the woman's assigned name, Eliza Bell, her age of 27 years, her declared skill as a seamstress, and the final sale price of $2,100. In the margin, written in a different ink and possibly years later, someone added a single phrase, "unusually beautiful." The ledger page shows no sign of damage, no water stain, no later insertion that might explain the interruption. The 7 minutes simply exist on the page as an absence. What happened during those 7 minutes was witnessed by perhaps 40 people. The merchant Henri Beaumont, 43 years old and known throughout St. Martin Parish as a notary of impeccable reputation, had stepped forward to inspect the woman before bidding. She stood on a low wooden platform that creaked when anyone moved across it. Her head had been lowered throughout the auction, her gaze fixed on the planks beneath her bare feet. Several buyers had already examined her hands, her teeth, and the quality of her posture. They had discussed her among themselves in the coded language of livestock assessment, but none had yet seen her eyes. When Henri Beaumont stopped directly in front of her, she raised her face. What passed between them in that moment was not visible to most of the crowd. Theodore Boudreau, seated at an angle approximately 12 feet from the platform, had the clearest view. He saw Henri Beaumont's expression change. He saw the woman hold Henri's gaze without lowering her eyes. He saw Henri's right hand, which had been reaching toward her chin, stop in midair. But Theodore never described any of this in writing. When asked about it decades later by a researcher compiling parish records, he said only that the woman had grey eyes. The grey eyes in question contained a distinctive feature. Around each pupil ran a ring of gold, a thin circlet of amber pigment that caught the overcast light and held it. This characteristic, which medical texts of the period called heterochromia iridum, was rare enough to be noted in physical descriptions. It had been noted, in fact, in a set of court documents filed 19 months earlier at the Orleans Parish Courthouse. The documents pertained to the disappearance of a free woman of color named Adele Fournier, a dressmaker of 30 years, last seen boarding a steamboat bound for Bayou Teche on March 29, 1857. Witnesses had testified that she fell overboard during a sudden squall near the Atchafalaya Basin. Her body was never recovered. Her death was declared by a parish judge on May 4th of that same year, and her estate, including a modest but profitable dressmaking shop on Rampart Street, had been inventoried and distributed to her legal heirs. Henri Beaumont had served as the notary who authenticated the witness statements, certified the death declaration, and stamped the inventory of Adele Fournier's possessions. He had handled every page of that file with his own hands. The woman on the platform had been living under the name Eliza Bell for approximately 17 months. In that time, she had been sold 3 times. Each sale was accompanied by paperwork that appeared legitimate: a bill of sale from a planter in St. Landry Parish, a transfer record from a cotton broker in Opelousas, a receipt from a physician who certified her general health. but the documents that should have established her origin, her prior residence, or the identity of her mother did not exist. Not one of the three sellers could produce a birth record, a baptismal certificate, or a manumission document that predated March of 1857. When pressed, the first seller claimed the papers had been lost in a fire. The second said they had been provided by the first, and he had accepted them in good faith. The third did not respond to inquiries at all, having closed his business and moved to Texas within weeks of the sale. The bidding for Eliza Bell had reached $1,100 when Henry Beaumont raised his hand. His voice, according to one witness who later spoke to a newspaper correspondent, was calm and measured. He offered $1,500. When a planter from Lafayette countered with $1,600, Henri raised his bid to $1,800 without hesitation. At $1,900, a cotton factor from Alexandria entered the competition. Henri looked at him once, then said, $2,100. The speed of his bidding, the absence of consultation with an overseer or agent, and the amount itself, which was far above the typical price for a domestic servant of any description, silenced the courtyard. The factor from Alexandria withdrew. The planter from Lafayette, after a pause that Theodore Boudreau did not record, shook his head. The sale was concluded. Henri Beaumont did not remain to settle the account. He instructed his driver, a man named Eustache, to bring the woman to the carriage and to tell no one where they were going. He mounted his horse and rode ahead toward the Beaumont property, a two-story house with a wraparound gallery situated 4 miles east of St. Martinville, on a narrow road that followed the bends of Bayou Teche. The house, built in 1831 by Henry's father, a French immigrant who had prospered in the indigo trade before transitioning to sugar, stood at the end of an avenue of moss-draped oaks. The property included a kitchen building, a smokehouse, quarters for the enslaved workers, a stable, a carriage house, and a small office where Henri conducted his notarial business. By the time the carriage arrived, Henri had already dismissed 3 of the domestic workers, sending them to the fields with instructions relayed through his overseer. To his wife, Claire Beaumont, a woman of 41 years who had been confined to her bedroom for the better part of 2 years by a progressive weakness of the lungs. He explained that he had purchased a seamstress to help with household duties. Claire, who rarely questioned her husband's decisions, accepted the explanation and asked to meet the new servant. Henri said she would be presented the following day, after she had been properly clothed and instructed. That night, Henri locked the door of the ground-floor room where Eliza Bell had been placed. It was a small room, originally a storage pantry, with a single high window, a narrow bed, and a chair. He kept the key in his pocket. He did not speak to her again until the following morning. When he entered the room, she was sitting on the chair, her hands folded in her lap, her grey and gold eyes fixed on the door as though she had been expecting him. Henri closed the door behind him. He did not introduce himself or explain the household rules. He asked a single question. He asked if she knew a woman named Adèle Fournier. According to the account Henri later provided to investigators, the woman did not react with surprise or fear. She did not ask who Adèle Fournier was. She did not deny knowing the name. Instead, she said that she remembered fragments, pieces, images that did not connect. She remembered arriving at a plantation near Bayou Teche. She remembered a man who had offered her a glass of tea. She remembered that the tea had been bitter and that she had felt her limbs grow heavy within minutes of drinking it. She remembered waking in a room with no windows, on a mattress on the floor. A man she did not recognize had stood over her. He had told her that her freedom papers were forged, that she was a fugitive, and that if she tried to leave, she would be turned over to the authorities and transported to a prison farm in Baton Rouge. She remembered being moved. She remembered different houses, different names, different owners who all seemed to believe they were buying a legitimate piece of property. But she did not remember Adele Fournier. She did not remember a dressmaking shop on Rampart Street. She did not remember the name of the man who had offered her the tea. Henri listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he told her that she would remain in this room until he had verified certain facts. He said that no one in the household would be permitted to speak with her. He said that if she attempted to leave, she would be stopped. He did not explain why he had purchased her. He did not tell her that he had recognized her eyes from a death certificate he himself had authenticated. Over the following 2 weeks, Henri Beaumont began an investigation that he conducted entirely in private. He wrote letters to the Orleans Parish Courthouse requesting copies of documents related to the Fournier disappearance. He visited the office of the Saint Martin parish clerk and reviewed land transactions dating back to 1855. He rode alone to the plantation near Bayou Teche, where, according to Eliza's fragmented memory, she had been taken after her capture. The plantation belonged to a man named Gaston Thibodeau, a sugar planter of modest acreage who had died of yellow fever in the summer of 1858. His widow, a nervous woman in her late 50s, claimed to know nothing about any female prisoner kept on the property. She said her husband had occasionally housed travelers and business associates, but she did not keep records of his guests. When Henri mentioned Adele Fournier, the widow's expression did not alter. She said the name meant nothing to her. Henri did not believe her, but he had no authority to search the property, and asking too many questions risked alerting whoever else might have been involved in the fraud. The next piece of the puzzle came from the Orleans Parish Courthouse. The clerk who processed Henri's request, a young man named Auguste Picard, reported that several pages of the Fournier file appeared to have been removed. The witness statements were intact. The death certificate was intact, but the copy of Adele Fournier's birth registration, her business license, her tax receipts, and the sworn statements from 3 of her clients confirming her identity and her status as a free woman had all been extracted. The file showed no sign of forced entry. The pages had not been torn. They had been carefully lifted, their binding threads cut with precision, leaving no trace except the stubs along the inner margin. The only identifying physical description that remained in the file was the description attached to the original missing person notice, which Adele Fournier's sister had placed in the New Orleans Picayune on April 2nd, 1857. The notice described a woman of 30 years, medium height, slender build, dark hair worn in a low knot, and eyes of pale grey with a distinct golden ring around each pupil. The notice had been clipped and pasted into the court file. The person who removed the other documents had either overlooked it, or they had considered it irrelevant, or they had been interrupted before they could take it. In any case, it remained. And 1 year and 7 months later, it was the only piece of paper in the state of Louisiana that connected the woman standing on the auction platform to the dressmaker who had vanished from a steamboat. During the 3rd week of his investigation, Henri Beaumont found the book. It was an account ledger, small and leather-bound, tucked inside a drawer at the back of the office he maintained in St. Martinville. Henri had opened the drawer while searching for blank forms for a property transfer. The ledger was not his. He had never seen it before. It bore the initials M.D. stamped in gold on the front cover. These initials corresponded to Marcel Dufresne, a lawyer who had maintained a practice in St. Martinville between 1853 and 1858. Marcel Dufresne had been a frequent client of Henri's notarial services. He had also been the attorney who represented the heirs to Adele Fournier's estate during the probate proceedings. The ledger contained, among ordinary entries for legal fees and court costs, a series of payments that Henri could not immediately explain. A payment of $300 to a Captain Francis Arnault, dated March 30th, 1857. a payment of $150 to a Dr. Lucien Moreau, dated April 1st of the same year, a payment of $200 to Gaston Thibodeau, dated April 5th. The dates formed a sequence that began the day after Adèle Fournier's disappearance and ended the week after her death was declared. Henri closed the ledger and did not show it to anyone. He returned to his house and went directly to the locked room where Eliza Bell was being held. He placed the ledger on the chair and asked her if she recognized the name Marcel Dufresne. This time, her reaction was immediate. She stood up. She did not look at the ledger. She looked at Henri's face. And she asked him, in a voice that was quiet but entirely steady, whether he had come to kill her or to help her. Henri did not answer that question. He left the room and locked the door behind him. The depth of Henri Beaumont's entanglement with Marcel Dufresne's schemes would take several more weeks to become fully apparent. During the years 1855 through 1857, Henri had notarized dozens of documents for Dufresne's clients, many of whom were free black adults who had acquired property through purchase, inheritance, or manumission. These documents included loan agreements, property transfers, liens, and mortgages. At the time Henri signed and stamped them, he believed they were standard civil transactions. But when he reviewed his own records in light of the ledger, he began to notice a pattern. The borrowers were often people who could not read French legal script. The debts were structured with compounding clauses that were not explained to the signatories. The properties were appraised at values far below market rates. And when the debts inevitably went unpaid, the properties were transferred to creditors who turned out to be shell entities controlled by Dufresne himself. Henri's notarial stamp appeared on 17 such transactions. In each case, his signature certified that the parties had appeared before him voluntarily, that they had understood the terms, and that the documents carried the full force of law. He had placed his seal beside his name without, he would later claim, reading the documents in full. He had trusted Dufresne. They had dined together. Their wives had exchanged Christmas gifts. When Dufresne praised Henri's thoroughness and professionalism, Henri had accepted the compliment without examining its motive. But Adèle Fournier had examined the motive. According to fragments of testimony that would later emerge, she had learned of Dufresne's methods from a client whose house had been seized through a fraudulent lien. The client, an elderly carpenter named Julien Moret, had come to her shop in tears, clutching a notice of eviction and a document he could not read. Adèle, who was fluent in both English and French and who had been taught to read legal documents by a previous employer, translated the text for him. She discovered that the lien was based on a debt that Julien Moret had never incurred, to a creditor he had never met, for repairs to a property he did not own. When she helped him file a complaint, the parish clerk dismissed it on procedural grounds. When she wrote a letter to the creditor's attorney, the letter was returned unopened. When she searched the parish records for other cases involving the same creditor, she found 14 similar filings, all notarized by Henri Beaumont, all involving free black property owners who had signed documents they could not read. Adèle Fournier had begun collecting evidence. She had visited the properties. She had interviewed the victims. She had copied deeds, mortgages, liens, and court orders. By March of 1857, she had assembled a file of 31 pages that traced the full architecture of the scheme. Her plan, described in a letter she sent to her sister the day before her trip, was to deliver the file to an editor at the New Orleans Tribune, a bilingual newspaper that had recently begun publishing exposés of legal abuses against free people of color. She believed that public exposure would force the parish courts to reopen the cases, and that the evidence she had gathered would be sufficient to disbar Dufresne and revoke Henri's notarial commission. She told no one else about the file. She did not tell her sister where she had hidden the originals. She did not tell the newspaper editor what she was bringing. only that she had information of public interest. And on the morning of March 29th, she boarded the steamboat Belle of the Teche at the New Orleans waterfront and began the journey upriver toward Bayou Teche. The journey should have taken 2 days. It ended somewhere near the Atchafalaya Basin, at a bend in the river where the steamboat stopped to take on cordwood. According to the testimony later collected by the parish court, Adele disembarked during the stop, perhaps to stretch her legs or to buy food from a vendor on the landing. A squall came up suddenly, one of the fast-moving storms common in that region during early spring. The wind rose, the light dimmed. When the passengers reboarded and the boat cast off, Adele Fournier was not among them. The captain, a man named Francis Arnaud, noted her absence in the ship's log with the phrase, "passenger missing, presumed overboard." He did not turn the boat around to search. He did not notify the authorities at the next landing. He continued his route and docked at St. Martinville on schedule, where he unloaded his cargo, recorded his manifests, and collected his fees. The first witness who claimed to have seen Adele fall was a deckhand who gave his name as Pierre Lafitte. His statement was taken by Henri Beaumont on April 8, 1857, in the presence of Marcel Dufresne. Pierre Lafitte described seeing a woman matching Adele's description lose her footing on the wet deck during the storm. He claimed to have thrown a rope, but said the current was too strong. His statement was notarized, filed, and never questioned. 2 months after the probate was closed, Pierre Lafitte purchased a small farm in St. Tammany Parish with cash. The second witness was a passenger named Marie-Claire Dumont, a widow traveling from New Orleans to Opelousas to visit her son. She told Henri that she remembered the woman with grey eyes because she had noticed them during the boarding. She remembered seeing the woman go toward the railing when the storm began. She remembered hearing a splash. Her statement was brief, specific, and entirely consistent with Pierre Lafitte's account. Marie-Claire Dumont moved to Mobile, Alabama, 6 weeks after giving her testimony. The letter confirming her new address was found among Marcel Dufresne's papers, written on stationery from a mobile boarding house and postmarked July 1857. The third witness was never identified by name. His statement, recorded on a loose sheet of paper tucked at the back of the court file, was unsigned and undated. It simply said, "I saw the colored woman fall." The handwriting did not match any of the other documents in the file. 23 days after Adele Fournier vanished from the steamboat, the first sale of a woman matching her description was recorded in St. Landry Parish. The seller was a cotton broker named Jerome Delaunay, who did business with Gaston Thibodeau. The buyer was a planter whose name appears in no other parish records. The price was $900. The woman was listed under the name Sarah. The second sale occurred in September of 1857. The buyer was a brick manufacturer in Opelousas. The woman was listed under the name Celeste. The third sale occurred in April of 1858. The seller was an agent representing the estate of the brick manufacturer, who had died of cholera the previous winter. The buyer was an auction house in St. Martinville. The woman was listed under the name Eliza Bell. Her age was given as 27. Her skill was listed as seamstress. The documentation for each sale appeared at first glance to be in order. The bills of sale recorded plausible origins. The transfer papers carried the stamps of legitimate notaries. The receipts for board, clothing, and medical care were signed by people who could be found in parish directories. But none of the documents predated March of 1857. No birth record, no manumission certificate, no apprenticeship contract, and no prior registration of any kind existed for Sarah, Celeste, or Eliza Bell. The three names, linked by nothing but the dates of their recorded appearances and the physical person who answered to them, formed a chain that began the day Adele Fournier stepped onto the steamboat and ended the morning Henri Beaumont looked into a pair of grey and gold eyes. What Henri discovered during his private investigation was that Marcel Dufresne had not acted alone. The payments in the ledger formed a map of complicity. Captain Francis Arnaud had been paid to falsify the ship's log and to prevent a search for the missing passenger. Dr. Lucien Moreau had been paid to provide a medical document that would certify the woman's health for sale and to supply a sedative that could be administered in tea. Gaston Thibodeau had been paid to detain a prisoner on his property during the period when the fraudulent death investigation was being conducted. Jérôme Delaunay, the cotton broker, had been paid to act as the first seller, providing a plausible commercial history that would distance the transaction from the original crime. And the estate of Adèle Fournier had been looted not primarily for its monetary value, which was modest, but to destroy her credibility, to seize her records, and to ensure that anyone who might have known her as a free woman would have no documentary basis for challenging her new status. But Henri had also discovered something that Marcel Dufresne had never intended anyone to find. At the back of the account ledger, written in a hand so small that Henri nearly overlooked it, was a list of notarial acts. Each entry consisted of a date, a document number, and a notation that appeared to be a code: ND, ND, CC, ND, PC, CC. Henri studied the list for several minutes before he understood. The codes corresponded to categories of fraud. ND for debtor non existente, a non-existent debt. CC for contrefait, a counterfeit contract. PC for procuration clandestine, a hidden power of attorney. And beside each code, a document number that matched the filing numbers in Henri's own notarial register. Henri took the list and the ledger to his home and locked them in a cabinet in his study. He did not confront Marcel Dufresne, who had abruptly closed his St. Martinville office in June of 1858 and relocated his practice to Natchez, Mississippi, citing unspecified business opportunities. He did not share his findings with the parish authorities, several of whom had purchased property through Dufresne's shell entities. He did not even tell his wife, whose condition had worsened and who now rarely left her bed. Instead, he continued to visit the locked room on the ground floor, where the woman who called herself Eliza Bell sat in the chair by the window, watching him with eyes that seemed to measure the depth of his fear. During one of these visits, she told him something that he had not expected. She told him that her memory had never been as damaged as she had let him believe. She explained this calmly, without anger or accusation. During her months of captivity, she said, she had learned that confusion was a kind of armor. Owners wanted workers who could follow instructions, but they did not want workers who could remember faces, dates, places, or names. A woman who seemed disoriented, who mixed up the details of her own story, who appeared to have lost large portions of her past, was less threatening. She was less likely to be sold to distant markets where no one would ever look for her. And she was more likely to be transferred within the region, among a network of buyers who had some connection to the original crime, because a confused woman could not testify. Eliza told Henri that she remembered everything. She remembered arriving at Gaston Thibodeau's plantation. She remembered the taste of the bitter tea. She remembered the face of Marcel Dufresne, who had visited the room without windows on the second day of her captivity, and had explained in a tone of professional regret that her freedom documents were inconsistent and could not be verified. She remembered the sound of papers being burned in a metal basin. She remembered the weight of the shackles on her wrists during the transfer to Jérôme Delaunay's property. And she remembered the moment, nearly a year later, when she first heard that she was to be sold at auction in St. Martinville. It was then, she said, that she began to wait for Henri Beaumont. Henri asked her why. She told him that she had recognized him during her captivity. He had visited Gaston Thibodeau's plantation in April of 1857, 3 weeks after her abduction. He had not entered the room where she was being held. He had spoken with Thibodeau on the gallery, their voices low, their conversation punctuated by long silences. She had seen him through a crack in the wall, his profile unmistakable, his posture that of a man who was both a participant and an intruder in the business being discussed. She had not known his name then, but she had memorized his face. And when the auctioneer announced that Henri Beaumont was among the bidders, she had understood that her moment had arrived. She raised her eyes on the platform, not because she was submitting to inspection. She raised them because she wanted Henri to see the gold rings around her pupils. She wanted him to see the evidence that his co-conspirators had been unable to destroy. And she wanted him to act in front of 40 witnesses in a way that would commit him to acknowledging who she was. Henri had not purchased her out of compassion. He had purchased her because, in the instant their eyes met, he had calculated the risk. If another buyer took her, she might eventually recover her full memory and name him. If she was sold out of state, she might come into contact with abolitionist networks that would investigate her story and trace it back to him. The safest course, Henri had concluded during those 7 silent minutes, was to keep her close, to control her, to determine what she knew and what she could prove, and if necessary, to find a way to resolve the problem that his own notarial seal had helped to create. But he had not anticipated that she too was waiting, that the auction was not a moment of submission, but a calculated confrontation, that the 7 minutes of silence recorded in Theodore Boudreau's ledger were not an absence, but a negotiation conducted without words, between 2 people who each believed they held the upper hand. And neither of them knew during those 7 minutes that the most important copies of Adèle Fournier's files were not in Henri Beaumont's study, not in Marcel Dufresne's abandoned office, and not in the Orleans parish courthouse. They were in a boarding house in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans, in a cedar chest belonging to a 46-year-old widow named Ruth Landry, who had been Adèle Fournier's friend and confidant for 11 years. Adèle had delivered the copies to Ruth on the night before her journey, with instructions that if she did not return within 2 weeks, the file should be mailed to a specific editor in Boston and to 2 lawyers whose names she had written on a folded piece of paper. Ruth Landry had waited. When the newspaper carried the notice of Adèle's death by drowning, Ruth had removed the file from the cedar chest and read every page. She had closed her boarding house for 3 days and taken the steamboat to Baton Rouge, where she consulted a lawyer whose name Adèle had not written down, but whom she trusted through her church. The lawyer, after reviewing the documents, told Ruth that the evidence of fraud was substantial, but that no Louisiana court would accept a case brought by a black woman against white lawyers and notaries. He advised her to wait. He advised her to be patient. He advised her to find a way to get the documents into the hands of someone who could publish them without being silenced. Ruth Landry returned to New Orleans and waited. She waited for 14 months. She waited through the summer of 1857, the autumn, the winter, the spring and summer of 1858. She waited until November, when a letter arrived from St. Martinville, written in a hand she did not recognize, but signed with a name she knew. The letter was brief. It said that a woman matching Adèle's description had been sold at auction to a notary named Henri Beaumont. It said that the woman was alive, and it said that the time to act was now. On the 3rd of December 1858, Ruth Landry packed the file into a canvas satchel, boarded a train to Cincinnati, and from there traveled by stagecoach to Boston, where she delivered the documents in person to the office of The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper whose editor, William Lloyd Garrison, had been publishing accounts of Southern legal abuses for more than 2 decades. Ruth Landry arrived in Boston on the 11th of December, 1858, after a journey of 8 days through winter weather that had frozen the Ohio River and delayed her stagecoach outside Pittsburgh. She carried a single canvas satchel containing the 31 pages Adele Fournier had assembled, along with 12 additional pages of notes Ruth had compiled during the intervening months. The notes included the names of 17 free black property owners who had lost their homes through Marcel Dufresne's scheme, the dates of the fraudulent transactions, the notarial registration numbers that corresponded to Henri Beaumont's seal, and a timeline of Adele's disappearance that Ruth had reconstructed from newspaper accounts, steamboat schedules, and the testimony of a deckhand who had worked on the Belle of the Teche and who had been dismissed shortly after the incident. The deckhand, a young man from St. James Parish named Émile Roussel, had contacted Ruth through intermediaries in the summer of 1858. He told her that he had been present on the steamboat during the stop at the Atchafalaya Basin. He had not witnessed Adele fall overboard, because she had not fallen overboard. She had been met at the landing by a man in a dark coat who had helped her into a wagon. Émile Roussel had seen this from the boiler deck, where he was stacking cordwood. When he mentioned it to the first mate, he was told to keep his observations to himself. When he mentioned it again to a fellow deckhand, he was reassigned to the engine room for the remainder of the trip. When he arrived at St. Martinville, Captain Francis Arnaud paid him his wages and told him his services were no longer required. Émile Roussel did not contest the dismissal. He walked to the nearest road and began the long journey home, carrying with him a piece of information that he knew could cost him more than his job, but that he did not know how to use. Ruth had written down Émile Roussel's account in longhand, signed it, and asked 2 witnesses to attest to his identity. She included his statement in the file she brought to Boston. William Lloyd Garrison was 53 years old in December of 1858. He had been publishing The Liberator for 27 years. His office on Washington Street was a cluttered space of stacked newspapers, galley proofs, and correspondence from abolitionist committees across the northern states. When Ruth Landry arrived at his door, she was admitted after a wait of nearly 2 hours. She presented the file without preamble. She told him that the documents contained evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving kidnapping, fraud, false imprisonment, and the systematic theft of property from free black citizens of Louisiana. She told him that the primary victim was still alive, being held in a private residence in St. Martinville under conditions that amounted to continued captivity, even if her legal status as property had been temporarily suspended by her purchaser's private knowledge of her true identity. And she told him that the conspiracy extended to men who still held positions of public trust in the Louisiana legal system. Garrison read the file in Ruth's presence. His reading took 45 minutes. When he finished, he asked 3 questions. First, he asked whether the woman called Eliza Bell could be produced to testify in a northern court. Ruth told him she could not, because she remained in Louisiana and would be arrested as a fugitive if she attempted to leave. Second, he asked whether any Louisiana judge would issue a warrant for Marcel Dufresne's arrest, based on the evidence provided. Ruth told him that the judge with jurisdiction over St. Martin Parish was a former business associate of Dufresne's, that the parish sheriff had purchased a foreclosed property through one of the shell entities, and that no black person had ever successfully sued a white lawyer in that district. Third, he asked what outcome Ruth hoped to achieve by bringing the file to him. Ruth told him she wanted the documents published, not summarized, not excerpted, published in full with the names, the dates, the registration numbers, and the signatures reproduced exactly as they appeared in the originals. She told him that Adele Fournier had assembled the file for this purpose, and that the only way to protect the victims of Dufresne's scheme was to make the scheme visible to anyone who could read. Garrison agreed. He told Ruth that the Liberator would publish the documents in a special edition, with an introduction explaining their provenance and significance. He also told her that the newspaper would forward copies to 2 federal attorneys in Ohio and Massachusetts who had recently been involved in prosecuting cases under the Fugitive Slave Act. The legal theory, Garrison explained, was that the Louisiana transactions had crossed state lines through the interstate slave trade, which might give federal courts jurisdiction over the fraud, even if Louisiana state courts refused to act. He did not promise that the strategy would succeed. He did not promise that Adele would be freed. He said only that the truth, once printed, could not be unprinted, and that the men named in the file would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. The special edition of The Liberator appeared on January 5, 1859. It ran to 16 pages, double the newspaper's usual length. The front page carried a headline in bold type, "A Free Woman Sold, The Anatomy of a Louisiana Conspiracy." The interior pages reproduced Adele Fournier's documents in facsimile, with translations of the French legal terms provided in brackets. The final page listed the names of 17 property owners who had been defrauded, the addresses of their lost homes, and the current occupants of those properties, who in most cases were white planters and merchants who had purchased the foreclosed lots from Dufresne's shell entities at prices far below market value. The edition reached New Orleans within 2 weeks. Copies were circulated among the free black community, read aloud in barbershops and boarding houses, and discussed in the backrooms of churches. Within a month, a second newspaper, the New Orleans Tribune, had reprinted the documents in French, adding context about the local legal system and the vulnerability of free black property owners. By February, the story had been picked up by newspapers in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, each adding editorial commentary about the broader implications of the case. In St. Martinville, the reaction was delayed but decisive. The parish sheriff, a man named Jules Robichaud, received a copy of The Liberator from an anonymous source in New Orleans. He read it over the course of a single evening and understood immediately that the documents implicated not only Marcel Dufresne, who had fled the state, but also Henri Beaumont, who had not. On the morning of February 18th, Jules Robichaud rode to the Beaumont property with 2 deputies. He found Henri in his study, the account ledger open on his desk, a letter half-finished before him. The letter was addressed to the parish district attorney. In it, Henri offered to testify fully and truthfully about his role in the notarization of fraudulent documents, to surrender his notarial seal and commission, and to provide evidence against Marcel Dufresne in exchange for immunity from prosecution for himself. Henri had been drafting and redrafting the letter for more than a week, ever since he had learned through a business contact in New Orleans that Ruth Landry's file had been published in Boston. He had understood in that moment that the architecture of the conspiracy was now public, that his name was attached to it, and that the only remaining choice was whether he would be named as a defendant or a witness. Jules Robichaud read the letter without comment. He told Henri that he was not there to arrest him, though he did not say that he would refrain from doing so in the future. He was there, he said, to ask Henri to produce the woman who had been purchased at the November auction. Henri led the sheriff to the locked room on the ground floor. He unlocked the door. Inside, the woman who had been sold as Eliza Bell was sitting on the chair, wearing a dress of grey wool that Henri's wife had ordered for her from a seamstress in Breaux Bridge. She had gained weight during the 3 months of her confinement. Her hair had been cut and dressed. She looked, the sheriff would later remark, like a woman who had been waiting for someone to open the door. The sheriff asked her to state her name. She told him without hesitation that her name was Adele Fournier. She told him she was a free woman of color, born in New Orleans to a free mother, and that she had been kidnapped, imprisoned, and sold into slavery through a criminal conspiracy. She told him she could prove her identity if he would permit her to retrieve documents from the custody of Ruth Landry. She told him she wished to press charges against Marcel Dufresne, Captain Francis Arnaud, Dr. Lucien Moreau, and any other persons who had participated in her abduction and sale. She did not mention Henri Beaumont. The omission was deliberate. Jules Robichaud was not a sympathetic audience. He had known Henri Beaumont for 15 years. He had purchased firewood from Gaston Thibodeau. He had attended the same church as Marcel Dufresne before Dufresne's departure for Mississippi, but the documents published in the Liberator had made the case impossible to ignore, and the presence of a woman who claimed, credibly and calmly, to be the victim of a kidnapping was a problem that could not be resolved with silence. He told Adele that he would escort her to the parish courthouse, where her statement would be recorded and her identity would be verified by witnesses who had known her before her disappearance. He told Henri that he would be summoned to testify at a hearing to be scheduled within the month. And he told both of them that in the meantime, Adele Fournier was not to be confined, restrained, or removed from the parish without the court's permission. The parish hearing began on March 7, 1859, in a small courtroom in St. Martinville. The presiding judge was a man named Alphonse Landry, no relation to Ruth, a jurist of 62 years who had served on the parish bench for 18 years and who was known for his caution in matters that attracted outside attention. The courtroom was crowded. Reporters from the New Orleans Picayune, the Tribune, and 2 northern newspapers occupied the front benches. A sketch artist from Harper's Weekly sat in the corner, drawing the participants in quick strokes. Adele Fournier entered the courtroom wearing the same grey dress, her head uncovered, her grey and gold eyes meeting the gaze of every person who looked at her. The first witness called was Ruth Landry, who had traveled from Boston to testify. She presented the original documents Adele had left in her keeping, including Adele's birth registration, her baptismal certificate, her business license, and letters from clients confirming her identity. She also presented Émile Roussel's statement describing the wagon that had met Adele at the Atchafalaya landing. The testimony took most of the morning. By noon, the court had established, to the satisfaction of Judge Landry, that the woman standing before him was indeed Adele Fournier, a free woman of color who had been wrongfully enslaved. The second witness was Henri Beaumont. He testified for nearly 3 hours. He described his recognition of Adele at the auction. He described his decision to purchase her. He described his subsequent investigation and his discovery of Marcel Dufresne's ledger. He admitted that he had notarized documents for Dufresne without reading them thoroughly, and he acknowledged that his negligence had enabled the fraud. But he denied any knowledge of the kidnapping. He denied any participation in the falsification of Adele's death. He denied having been present at Gaston Thibodeau's plantation in April of 1857, though his voice wavered when he said it. Adele, seated in the front row of the courtroom, did not react. She had made a calculation. Henri's testimony, even if it included lies of omission, was necessary to establish the broader conspiracy. If she contradicted him publicly, she risked undermining the case against Dufresne and the others, who would seize upon any inconsistency to discredit the entire proceeding. She had waited for nearly 2 years. She could wait a little longer. The third witness was Captain Francis Arnaud, who had been located in Baton Rouge and brought to St. Martinville under subpoena. He was a red-faced man of 58 years, with a white beard and hands that trembled from years of heavy drinking. His testimony was belligerent and contradictory. He denied having falsified the ship's log. He denied having been paid by Dufresne. He denied having failed to search for the missing passenger. When confronted with the ledger entry showing a payment of $300, he claimed it was for an unrelated cargo transaction. When asked to produce records of that transaction, he said the papers had been lost in a steamboat fire the previous year. Judge Landry ordered him held for further questioning. Dr. Lucien Moreau could not be called to testify. He had died of a stroke in October of 1858, 3 weeks before the auction at St. Martinville. His widow, when questioned by the sheriff, claimed to have no knowledge of her husband's business with Marcel Dufresne. She did, however, produce a vial of a compound that had been found among her husband's medical supplies. The compound, when analyzed by a chemist in New Orleans, was identified as a concentrated tincture of opium mixed with valerian root, a sedative strong enough to render an adult unconscious within 15 minutes of ingestion. The dose matched the description Adele had given of the bitter tea she had drunk at Gaston Thibodeau's plantation. Gaston Thibodeau could not be called to testify either. He was dead of yellow fever, buried in the family plot behind his plantation house. His widow, the nervous woman Henri had interviewed months earlier, was summoned to the hearing. She claimed to have burned her husband's personal papers after his death, following his instructions. When asked why a dying man would care about the destruction of his correspondence, she did not answer. The court did not press her. The hearing concluded on March 11th with a ruling by Judge Landry. Adele Fournier was declared legally free, and her identity as a free woman of color was restored. The auction sale to Henri Beaumont was voided. The parish clerk was ordered to correct the ledger entry from Eliza Bell to Adele Fournier, free woman of color, wrongfully sold. But the court declined to indict anyone for the crime of kidnapping. The evidence, Judge Landry ruled, was circumstantial. The ledger showed payments, but it did not prove conspiracy. The testimony of Émile Roussel placed Adele in a wagon, but it did not identify the driver. The sedative compound proved that Dr. Moreau had possessed the means to incapacitate a person, but it did not prove that he had done so. The fraudulent notarizations proved that Henri Beaumont had been negligent, but they did not prove that he had been criminal. The case against Marcel Dufresne, the judge concluded, was strong enough to warrant a warrant for his arrest, but only if he could be located and extradited from Mississippi, a process that would require the cooperation of authorities who had shown no inclination to assist. Marcel Dufresne was not extradited. When the sheriff of Adams County, Mississippi, received the warrant from St. Martinville, he dispatched 2 deputies to Dufresne's office in Natchez. They found the office locked and a sign posted on the door reading, "Closed for family emergency." A neighbor reported that Dufresne had left town 3 days earlier with his wife and 2 trunks. He had told no one where he was going. The sheriffs of 4 Mississippi counties were notified, but no trace of Dufresne was found. 6 months later, a letter postmarked from Veracruz, Mexico, was delivered to a client of Dufresne's in Natchez. The letter offered no return address. It said only that Marcel Dufresne regretted the inconvenience and trusted that his clients would find competent representation elsewhere. Captain Francis Arnaud was released after 4 days of questioning. He returned to Baton Rouge, where he continued to work as a steamboat pilot on the Mississippi River for another 11 years. He died in 1870, not from the consequences of his crimes, but from a boiler explosion aboard the steamboat Prairie Star, which killed 23 passengers and crew. His body was recovered from the river 2 days later and buried in an unmarked grave in the Baton Rouge Potter's Field. The other participants in the conspiracy fared differently. Jerome Delaunay, the cotton broker who had arranged the first sale, declared bankruptcy in 1860 and fled to Texas, where he died of tuberculosis in a boarding house in Galveston. The agent who had handled the third sale closed his business and moved to Alabama, where he worked as a clerk in a mobile shipping office until his death in 1873. The planter who had purchased Adele under the name Sarah sold his property in 1861 and moved to Illinois, where he lived quietly until his death 20 years later. None of them were ever prosecuted. Henri Beaumont surrendered his notarial commission in April of 1859. He was not charged with any crime. His cooperation with the investigation, combined with his social standing and the reluctance of the parish authorities to pursue a case that had already attracted unwelcome attention from the northern press, protected him from legal consequences, but the social consequences were severe. His wife, Claire, died of her lung condition in June of 1859, having learned the full story of her husband's involvement only weeks before her death. His business associates distanced themselves. His invitations to social functions ceased. His name, which had once commanded respect in St. Martin Parish, became synonymous with scandal and duplicity. He remained in the house on Bayou Teche for another 5 years, living alone except for a single servant. In 1864, during the Union occupation of the region, the house was commandeered by federal troops and used as a quartermaster's depot. Henri was permitted to occupy a single room on the second floor. He spent his days reading old newspapers and writing letters that he never sent. In December of 1864, he contracted pneumonia and died at the age of 49. The parish death register listed the cause of death as congestion of the lungs and his occupation as former notary. His estate, which had been substantially diminished by legal fees and the loss of his business, was distributed to distant relatives in France who had never met him. Adèle Fournier returned to New Orleans in April of 1859. She found her dressmaking shop on Rampart Street occupied by a tenant who had rented it from the heirs who had inherited her estate. The lease had 6 months remaining. Adèle did not contest it. She rented a smaller room on Ursuline Street and began rebuilding her clientele, one customer at a time. Many of her former patrons had assumed she was dead. Some wept when they saw her. Others were more reserved, uncertain how to treat a woman who had been legally dead, legally enslaved, and then legally alive again, all within the space of 2 years. Adèle did not ask for their sympathy. She asked for their business. The court had restored her name and her legal status, but it had not restored her property. The shop on Rampart Street had been sold during the probate proceedings, and the proceeds had been distributed to the heirs who had spent them. The furniture, fabrics, patterns, and sewing machines that had constituted the physical assets of her business were gone, sold at auction to settle the estate's debts. The money in her bank account had been withdrawn by the executor and used to pay legal fees. Adèle was free, but she was, in material terms, starting from nothing. She did not sue for restitution. Her lawyer, a man named François Leclerc, who had read about her case in the Tribune and had offered his services without charge, advised her that a civil suit would take years, that the defendants would tie the case up with procedural motions, and that the likelihood of recovering significant damages was low. Adèle accepted the advice with the same composure she had maintained throughout her ordeal. She was 32 years old in the spring of 1859. She had spent nearly 2 years as a prisoner. She did not want to spend 5 more as a litigant. Instead, she found work as a copyist. Her skills with documents, developed during her investigation of Dufresne's fraud, had made her one of the most careful readers of contracts in New Orleans. She began offering a service that combined translation, explanation, and document preparation for clients who did not read French legal script. Her clients were mostly free black artisans, laborers, and small property owners who needed deeds, wills, contracts, and business licenses. She charged modest fees and guaranteed accuracy. Within a year, she had more work than she could handle alone. She hired an assistant, a young woman named Céleste Martin, who had been freed by her owner's will 3 years earlier and who had been trained as a typesetter at a print shop on Chartres Street. Together, they operated a small office on Esplanade Avenue, a single room with 2 desks, a cabinet of blank forms, and a copy of the Louisiana Civil Code that Adele had purchased at auction from a bankrupt law library. The office at Esplanade Avenue became a center of a certain kind of quiet resistance. People came to Adele not only for documents, but for advice. They brought contracts they could not read and asked her to explain the clauses buried in the fine print. They brought letters from lawyers and asked her to translate the legal jargon into plain French or English. They brought stories of fraud, similar to the ones she had uncovered in St. Martin Parish, and asked her whether they had grounds for complaint. Adele listened to all of them. She did not offer legal representation because she was not a lawyer and could not appear in court. But she prepared documents, wrote letters, and directed her clients to the few attorneys who would accept cases from black plaintiffs. She became, without intending it, the person that people sought out when they suspected they were being cheated. In 1862, when Union forces captured New Orleans, the legal landscape shifted. The federal occupation authorities established a provost court that had jurisdiction over civil disputes involving freedmen and women. Adele began preparing documents for clients who brought cases before the provost court. She testified as an expert witness on several occasions, explaining the mechanics of fraudulent property transfers to judges who were unfamiliar with Louisiana's French-derived legal system. Her testimony was noted for its precision. She cited civil code articles by number. She identified forged signatures by comparing them with exemplars she had collected from parish archives. She built timelines that showed with documentary precision how properties had moved from their original owners to the shell entities controlled by men like Marcel Dufresne. Her reputation grew. In 1864, she was approached by a committee of abolitionist lawyers in Boston who were compiling a report on the legal mechanisms of property theft against free black Southerners before the war. Adele contributed a section to the report that described, in meticulous detail, the methods Dufresne had used, the role of notarial fraud, and the vulnerability of illiterate property owners to schemes that exploited their inability to read the documents they signed. The report was published in 1865 under the title Fraudulent Conveyances and the Free Negro Population of Louisiana, a documentary record. Adele's name did not appear on the title page, but her contribution was acknowledged in the introduction, which described her as a free woman of color, whose personal experience and investigative diligence have illuminated a species of legal crime that has gone largely unpunished. Ruth Landry remained in Boston after delivering the file to the Liberator. She continued to operate a boarding house, this one on Joy Street, where she rented rooms to abolitionists, journalists, and traveling lecturers. She and Adele corresponded regularly, their letters crossing the increasingly fraught geography of a nation at war with itself. Ruth's letters described the progress of the abolitionist movement, the political battles in Massachusetts, and the faces of the people who passed through her boarding house. Adele's letters described the slow work of reconstruction, the challenges of rebuilding a life in a city under occupation, and the steady stream of clients who came to her office with documents they could not read. In the autumn of 1865, Ruth received a visitor at her Boston boarding house. He was a tall man in his 60s, well-dressed, with a beard that had once been dark but was now mostly gray. He introduced himself as Marcel Dufresne. He said he had been living in Mexico for the past 6 years, first in Veracruz, then in Mexico City, where he had established a small law practice serving French expatriates. He had returned to the United States, he said, because the political situation in Mexico had become unstable, and because he believed that the war had erased the legal consequences of his actions in Louisiana. He was traveling to New Orleans to reclaim his property and his reputation. He had stopped in Boston to meet Ruth Landry. whose role in exposing his crimes he had learned about through northern newspapers that had circulated in Mexico City. Ruth did not invite him inside. She stood in the doorway of her boarding house and listened while he spoke. He explained that he bore her no ill will. He explained that his actions, while perhaps excessive, had been motivated by the need to protect the social order from the disruption that Adele Fournier's discoveries would have caused. He explained that the war had changed everything, that the old legal distinctions between free and enslaved had been abolished, and that there was no longer any point in pursuing old grievances. He offered to compensate Adele for the loss of her shop, provided that she would agree to sign a document releasing him from any future claims. Ruth told him that Adele Fournier was not her client, that she could not negotiate on Adele's behalf, and that in any case she would sooner burn her boarding house to the ground than facilitate any arrangement that would let Marcel Dufresne purchase absolution with money stolen from the people he had defrauded. She told him that if he set foot in New Orleans, he would be recognized. She told him that the documents Adele had assembled were still in circulation, that they had been reprinted in 3 states, and that the legal community of Louisiana, even in its diminished post-war condition, had not forgotten his name. She told him that if he wished to reclaim his reputation, he could begin by confessing his crimes in writing and surrendering himself to the federal authorities. Marcel Dufresne did not go to New Orleans. He returned to Mexico City, where he died of dysentery in 1867. The news reached Adele through a letter from a French merchant in Veracruz, who had recognized Dufresne's name from the published documents and who wrote to inform her that the last of her captors was dead. Adele read the letter at her desk on Esplanade Avenue. She did not weep. She did not celebrate. She folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and returned to the contract she'd been translating. The work continued. It had always continued. It would continue for the rest of her life. The auction ledger at the St. Martinville Parish Courthouse remained in its original binding until 1932, when a parish clerk undertook a project to recopy the oldest records into new volumes. The clerk, a young woman named Marguerite Fontenot, was the first person in decades to examine the November 12, 1858 entry with careful attention. She noted the 7-minute gap in the record, the unusual phrase, "unusually beautiful," written in the margin, and the name Eliza Bell that had been crossed out and replaced in a different hand with Adele Fournier FWC. The abbreviation stood for Free Woman of Color. Marguerite Fontenot was a graduate of the Louisiana State Normal School and had studied history under a professor who encouraged his students to investigate the documentary traces of people whose lives had been overlooked. She made a copy of the ledger page and began researching the case. Over the following 3 years, she located the probate file in Orleans Parish, the correspondence between Ruth Landry and William Lloyd Garrison at the Boston Public Library, and the report on fraudulent conveyances that Adele had contributed to in 1865. She tracked down descendants of the people Adele had helped and recorded their family stories. She traveled to Esplanade Avenue, where the building that had housed Adele's office had been replaced by a pharmacy, and to Rampart Street, where the dressmaking shop had been converted into a coffee warehouse. She also located the grave. Adele Fournier had died in 1889 at the age of 61 of a heart condition that had weakened her during her final year. She'd been buried in the St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 in a tomb shared with Ruth Landry, who had returned to New Orleans after the war and had lived with Adele until her own death in 1891. The tomb was modest, a simple whitewash structure with 2 names carved into the marble plaque: Adele Fournier, 1827 to 1889, and Ruth Landry, 1812 to 1891. Beneath the names, a single line of text read, "She knew the truth and told it. Marguerite Fontenot published her findings in 1935 in an article that appeared in the Louisiana Historical Quarterly under the title "The Auctioneer's Silence, a Case Study in Documentary Evidence and the Reconstruction of a Lost Identity." The article was academic in tone and reached a limited audience. It was cited in a handful of scholarly works over the following decades. It was not noticed by the general public, but the gap in the ledger remained. 7 unaccounted minutes on a November morning in 1858, the space between 2 lines of text, no wider than a thumbprint on the page, an absence that contained, if you knew how to read it, the entire architecture of a crime, the recognition, the calculation, the silent negotiation between 2 people whose fates had been intertwined long before the auctioneer opened his mouth. The woman who had been erased and the man who had helped erase her, facing each other across a wooden platform while 40 people watched, and a clerk's pen hovered above a page, not writing, not recording, not yet knowing what to say. The documents do not record what Adele Fournier thought during those 7 minutes. They do not record whether she felt fear or anger or something closer to the cold satisfaction of a gamble about to pay out. They record only that she raised her eyes, that Henri Beaumont met her gaze, and that for 7 minutes, in the courtyard of a mercantile warehouse in St. Martinville, Louisiana, the machinery of property stopped long enough for a person to be recognized. The ledger entry, as finally recopied by Marguerite Fontenot in 1932, includes a footnote. The footnote reads, "The 7-minute interruption has never been explained by any contemporary source. The purchaser, Henri Beaumont, later testified that he recognized the woman as Adele Fournier by the distinctive coloration of her eyes. The woman herself gave no public account of what passed between them during the silence." The footnote, in 12-point type at the bottom of a page in a bound volume, stored on a shelf in a parish courthouse in St. Martinville, Louisiana, is the only monument to the moment when a woman who had been declared dead, stripped of her name, and sold 3 times under false documents, used the only evidence her captors had not destroyed, to force the man who had authenticated her death to acknowledge that she was alive. And in the margin of the original ledger page, next to the space that represents 7 minutes, someone, perhaps Theodore Boudreau, perhaps a later clerk, perhaps Marguerite Fontenot herself, wrote a single phrase in pencil. The phrase has faded over the decades until it is barely legible. But if you hold the page at the correct angle, in the light that falls through the courthouse window on a winter afternoon, you can still read the words, "She made him look."